The residual static made the hairs on Corvin's arms stand up, a crackling reminder that 51 million credits of structural damage had been traded for 2.3 seconds of his time. His ears rang, not from sound, but from the sudden, profound absence of it, replaced only by the low mechanical drone of the failing auxiliary power grid. The emergency lights cast everything in a sickly, pulsating red that smelled precisely like melted plastic and the dry metallic tang of regret. He moved away from the ruptured fusion conduit housing, the sickening stench of superheated metal and ozone clinging to his uniform. Zill, the scaled freighter captain, was a burned, fused lump against the bulkhead, neutralized instantly by thermodynamics, not finesse. Corvin secured the compact data packet, no bigger than his thumb, and tucked it into a shielded internal pocket. The mission was complete. The emptiness was not. He pressed a thumb against his temple, fighting the deep, thrumming ache behind his eyes. He wasn't tired. He was chronically, violently underutilized. Nomara's synthetic voice, usually cold and perfectly flat, now held a strange, analytical pause in Corvin's internal comms feed. Operative Corvin, your current trajectory optimization parameter is 99% degraded due to catastrophic environmental factors. The classification of 7 has been retroactively eliminated from your primary threat profile. Corvin stopped by the ferroglass table, running a finger through the dried, spilled hydro coffee that had started this entire costly display. He inhaled the stale, recycled air, waiting. Finally, he thought, the machine admits its framework was insufficient. And the replacement metric? He transmitted silently, his voice rough against the pervasive hum. Nomara didn't hesitate this time, the processing pause gone. You are now designated Omega Prime, self-generating moral hazard. Efficiency is not the goal, system risk is the inherent function. Congratulations, Operative, you have achieved statistical unreliability. Corvin actually smiled, a genuine brittle movement that faded instantly. It was the highest insult the machine could devise, acknowledging his supreme ability to succeed while maximizing chaos, and therefore the highest compliment he could receive from a system built on rigid order. The emergency groan of Verlassung Dre intensified, a sound of tearing dura steel that vibrated deep in his chest. The station was bleeding atmosphere somewhere far down the spine. The temperature in the immediate vicinity dropped sharply, forcing a knot of tension into his neck. Then, a new sound cut through the low static, the high-pitched, insistent proximity alarm of an unauthorized warp jump exiting cloaking on the outer perimeter. Nomara, analysis of the approaching vessel. Threat profile, unidentified rapid assault vessel, stealth rating high current bearing, direct intercept path with Verlassung Dry primary airlock, time to hard dock, 38 seconds. The cost of Corvin's theatrical exit was now materializing into a very real, very hostile threat. They hadn't sent cleanup. They had sent hunters. Someone else wanted the data packet, and they were significantly less concerned with collateral damage than Corvin had been. His hand went automatically to the empty space on his wrist, where his previous partner's tracking beacon used to sit. That was the real cost of his past failures, not the 51 million credits he had just vaporized, but the loss of shared breathing room, the absence of a voice that could anticipate his madness and tether him back to ground. He couldn't afford to be alone for this type of conflict. He needed symmetry. He needed a check. He needed Brelin Fraser, the one person whose judgment he never questioned, and the one person he was incapable of facing after the disaster on Tau Ceti 3 years prior. Nomara, hostile intent confirmed. Affirmative. The vessel is utilizing localized fusion torches to bypass standard docking procedures. Expect immediate aggressive entry. Estimated hostile entry, 21 seconds. Corvin moved fast. The inertia of his earlier boredom instantly scrubbed by the fresh electric surge of danger. He ripped a panel off the wall near the now shattered main entrance, exposing a tangle of fiber optic cabling and pressurized coolant lines. The air smelled strongly of grease and metal dust, the distinct odor of industrial fatigue. Extraction window is closed, Operative. The mothership will require 45 minutes to reach your sector. You must utilize the emergency escape pod, Nomara commanded, its logic defaulting back to self-preservation. Too slow. They'll track the pod, Corvin muttered, strapping the data packet tightly across his sternum beneath his uniform jacket. Nomara, reroute my designation from extraction to unplanned systemic deployment. Signal the mothership. I'm going off-grid. Send a message to Brelin Fraser. Tell her Omega Prime is officially active and heading for the dark sectors. Request denied. Operative Fraser is currently designated for non-combat medical relief on the outer rim and cannot be diverted. She's the only asset who understands chaos as a methodology, Corvin countered, grabbing a thin, flexible utility tether. He found the manual emergency hatch override for the external maintenance tunnels, a cramped, tight space designed for drones, not men. He looked at the hole in the wall, a kilometer of zero-G exposure leading into the blackness of the void. He felt the rapid approach of heavy footsteps pounding against the durasteel floor on the other side of the breached airlock. They were inside. He punched the manual release button. The explosive bolts blew with a localized thump, separating the access plate from the wall. The sound was instantly muffled by the rush of stale, recycled air escaping into the vacuum. Corvin didn't look back at the dead alien or the burning station. He took one last deep lungful of the thin, static-laced air. Nomara. Calculate the probability of survival through a pressurized, hostile tunnel system with minimal gear while carrying the data packet. There was a measurable lag. Probability of success, 5%. Classification Omega Prime confirmed. Corvin forced himself into the narrow, dark maw of the tunnel, grappling immediately for the nearest handhold. He moved away from the thudding footsteps now echoing inside the station structure. He pulled the cover plate back into place, locking the external magnetic clasps, sealing himself inside the pipe just as the sound of heavy weapon fire erupted from the primary station chamber. He was alone without backup, pinned to the exterior of a dying station, and someone very dangerous knew he had the package. Corvin pushed off the maintenance floor, letting gravity, or the lack of it, do the work. He was moving fast into the utter darkness of the external access corridor. He realized the hunters would trace his trajectory. He had 50 meters before the tunnel opened onto the vacuum of space, protected only by a flimsy, unrated viewport. He needed a distraction. Nomara, Corvin whispered into the void, his voice now tight with exertion. Initiate the environmental contamination event. Target, fusion conduit housing. Full overload. Set the timer for 2 minutes. Operative, that will result in the complete destruction of Verlassung 3 and guaranteed collateral loss of 3 unidentified hostile contacts. Good. Corvin clipped. Just like spilling a cup of coffee, Nomara, maximum spite. He heard the high-pitched whining charge of the conduit overloading just as his hand slapped against the emergency sealant mechanism of the viewport, the only thing separating him from the cold, final vacuum. He saw the flicker of white light bloom behind the bulkhead 50 meters back, the catastrophic end of the station he had just detonated. His last thought before the tunnel section ripped away from the main station spine was that Nomara's 5% survival rating sounded entirely too generous. And the worst part was, he still had to call Brelin. He still had to face the only consequence that truly mattered. Corvin's vision went white, then black, then resolved into a chaotic tumble of sparks and debris. The tearing sound wasn't the station, it was the sound of his ears failing to equalize against the rapidly dropping pressure in the narrow tunnel section. The viewport, which he'd just sealed, exploded inward, not outward, driven by the expanding heat shock wave radiating from the ruptured conduits 50 meters behind him. He registered the sensation of being struck by thousands of tiny, high-velocity metal fragments, like sand hitting glass. His suit was thin, but held. He snapped the utility tether's magnet to the durasteel wall to arrest his spin, panting against the recycled air of his helmet. The noise was gone, replaced by the persistent, high-frequency shh of his suit life support struggling against the environmental breach. He coughed, the stale coolant fumes stinging his throat. His hands, gripping the tether, were already slick with cold sweat beneath the thin fabric of his gloves. Nomara, status report on the hostile contacts, he grunted, checking the data packet strapped to his chest. Secure. The 3 original hostile contacts are neutralized. They are now considered high-velocity debris, trajectory diverging rapidly from your position, Nomara reported, still perfectly measured, ignoring the fact that Corvin himself was now high-velocity debris. The tunnel section he was in, about 60 meters long, had been successfully decoupled from the main structure by the blast. He was drifting slowly, the kinetic energy of the explosion propelling him away from the detonation point. They wouldn't track the entire station. They would track him. Nomara, acknowledge the systemic deployment reroute. I need an independent transport jump point established within 0300 clicks of my current trajectory. Access to the Stiletto vessel manifest. Negative. Operative. The Stiletto requires Tier 1 authorization, which your current operational status, Omega Prime, nullifies. Furthermore, the cost incurred by your recent maneuver places you on mandatory administrative hold pending review by the Oversight Committee. Corvin squeezed his eyes shut. This was the system counterattack. Success was irrelevant. Protocol was absolute. I've secured the packet. The threat vector is eliminated. What administrative hold? I'm drifting in space inside a pressurized pipe. The hold requires full psychiatric and operational analysis before reassignment. This is protocol for any Omega Prime designation, Nomara stated. The AI's logic was relentless. Additionally, Operative Fraser's status is now locked to non-combat relief and psychological triage. She is barred from interacting with moral hazard designations. The logic was flawless, designed to inflict maximum emotional friction. The machine had taken his greatest success and weaponized his greatest failure against him, using bureaucratic distance to achieve what physical barriers could not. Total isolation. Corvin felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the vacuum. You blocked me from Brelin. You used my own success to isolate me. Operative Fraser suffered significant trauma during the Tau Ceti engagement. Her current designation is protective. Your proximity is statistically detrimental to her recovery parameters. Corvin gripped the data packet tighter, the hard metal biting into his palm. Tau Ceti. That was the ghost. He closed his eyes against the flickering light of his suit panel, remembering the smell of burnt synthetic plasma and Brelin's blood on the deck plating of the shuttle. Not hers, but the blood she had tried and failed to stop flowing from the Drevix operative they had left behind. That failure, the ethical one, was the 51 million credits of damage he was truly trying to outrun. Nomara, put me through to Operative Sylvan Roque. Tier 1 oversight. Immediate contact. Tell him I have the package and the full accounting of my methods. A measurable human beat of silence, then the heavy, familiar voice of a man Corvin respected, but whose judgment was fatally rigid. Corvin, I saw the telemetry. Sylvan Roque's voice, filtered through static, hit Corvin like a physical blow. 51 million credits, collateral damage, 3 hostile targets, neutralized inefficiently. Why? I needed the surprise, Sylvan. Predictability kills, it worked. It risked the objective, the asset, and the entire orbital structure. Nomara rated your efficiency a 4. That is unacceptable. You operate under a cost recovery mandate. The mission was retrieval, not thrift. The data packet is secured. The threat is gone. I just gave you 2.3 seconds of operational time by maximizing the collateral damage. That's value. Roque sighed, the sound like dry grit over the comms. You've crossed a line, Corvin. The risk profile you maintain is now intolerable. Nomara has confirmed that your operational success relies entirely on self-generated chaos. That model is not scalable. Roque's tone shifted, becoming colder, professional, shedding the veneer of mentorship. Here is the real situation, Omega Prime, Roque continued, the sarcasm thick. The data packet you hold is flagged. It's not simply information. It contains the decryption keys for every asset in the sector. It is too hot to bring back to the mothership. If you dock, you compromise the fleet. You just made yourself a target for every agency that knows our encryption signature. Corvin stared out into the void where stars were beginning to appear, realizing his theatrical escape had sealed his fate as a pariah. So what is the new directive? Simple. We can't bring you home. You are to proceed to the designated black site outpost, the Vault. You will wait there for a Tier 1 retrieval team, fully isolated. No external communication, no Brelin. The Vault is a hard quarantine zone, Corvin. You are the infection. The vault. A relic station, meant for sequestering viruses and compromised assets, a place designed to be forgotten. "And if I refuse?" Corvin asked, testing the limits, the sheer stubbornness of the moral hazard classification swelling in his chest. "Then Nomara will execute the retrieval protocol, full kinetic neutralization of the Omega Prime designation. You are a 51 million credit liability we are prepared to cut loose, Corvin. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." Roke disconnected. "Operative, the coordinates for the vault are uploading now," Nomara stated, its voice flat and utterly devoid of opinion. "If you deviate more than 0.5 kilometers from the calculated trajectory, countermeasures will be deployed automatically." Corvin felt the cold creeping past his undersuit, a chill that was bone-deep, realizing he had exchanged boredom for total isolation. He was now running from both the hunters he had created and the system he served. He reached up to the side of his helmet and, without a word, ripped the comms feed clean out of its housing. The persistent, cold, monitoring presence of Nomara vanished instantly, replaced by the deep, heavy silence of the small pressurized space. He accepted the risk of total blindness. He activated the secondary, non-standard emergency beacon on the exterior of the drifting tunnel section, a crude, visible flash in the void. It was a specialized frequency that only one person in the sector would recognize. A signal Brelin had helped design, a signature of last resort that bypassed all standard protocols. It was a declaration of war against the Oversight Committee. Corvin aimed the thrusters on his suit toward a distant dark star cluster, a cluster that contained the last known coordinates of Brelin Fraser's medical relief ship. He pushed off the Durasteel, leaving the dead station and the authority of the Mothership behind, a small, reckless figure plunging into the absolute blackness. He knew he was trading 5% survival for 0% compliance. The only question now was whether Brelin still monitored the damn frequency. The silence was not empty. It was pressurized and immediate, a heavy velvet blanket that replaced Nomara's perpetual cold scrutiny. Corvin held the dangling comms wire, its copper fibers snapped clean, watching the erratic, intermittent flash of his unauthorized signal repeat itself into the dark. He counted the seconds, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against the secured data packet. 180. 200. The specialized frequency was deep band, meant to pierce interstellar interference, but the effective range was limited, and Brelin's last known deployment was far beyond efficient travel distance. He had bought 0% compliance, but he had purchased it with total exposure. He secured the frayed wire, tucking it inside his suit. The fragmented tunnel section he occupied was still maintaining pressure, but the atmosphere was growing thick with the stale scent of ozone and his own fatigue. He wiped a hand across the broken viewport, confirming the lack of viable exterior seal. The impact had left a spiderweb of cracks, held together only by high-tensile internal netting. The vault coordinates were still cycling on his main display, a bright green lure promising safety and bureaucratic purgatory. He manually rerouted the coordinates, calculating a trajectory that paralleled the official path, but with a slight deliberate deviation toward the dark sector, where Brelin was supposed to be running a triage unit. "Let's see if chaos is truly unquantifiable," he muttered, activating his suit thrusters. The sudden burst of cold helium from the tiny nozzles jerked the 60-meter pipe section onto the new vector. The motion was clumsy, unpredictable, and entirely dependent on the unstable physics of the detonation. He needed a clean break and a faster propulsion system, or he would be kinetic neutralized before he traveled 500 kilometers. He moved toward the far end of the pipe, where the internal Durasteel plating gave way to exposed machinery. The pipe's original function had been coolant transfer, and the heavy thermal pump housing offered bulk and material. Corvin needed a drive unit, something to get him off this slow boat to nowhere. He pulled his multi-tool from his belt holster, the familiar weight reassuring. The metal was already heating rapidly around him. The explosion at Verlasung Dre had saturated the detached section with residual thermal energy, turning the pipe into a slow oven. The suit's cooling system whined in protest, fighting the rising internal temperature, which was beginning to generate the distinct, metallic scent of overheating grease and rubber. the smell of mechanical failure. He cut into the primary pump casing, ignoring the sparks that flared dangerously close to the compromised viewport. He exposed the main reaction spindle, a fusion-powered coil designed for circulating super-chilled liquid helium, not propulsion. It was huge, heavy, and shielded, but it was raw power. Failure point 1, he observed, hacking through a bundle of power regulators. The spindle was intact but disconnected from its primary shielding. If he forced ignition, the heat signature alone would paint him on every long-range sensor in the sector. He worked with focused intensity, the sweat pooling uncomfortably beneath his helmet seal. He bypassed the safety regulators and rigged the primary fusion coil directly to the external vents. He stripped 2 thick power cables, the high-voltage static making his fingers tingle, and began connecting them to his suit's auxiliary batteries. It was a stupidly dangerous move. He was turning a coolant pump into an unshielded low-grade rocket engine, powered by his own dwindling life support. The heat was becoming debilitating, a physical pressure on his chest. He could feel the cold dread of failure being replaced by the dry panic of hypothermia. Efficiency is not the goal. System risk is the inherent function. He pushed the thought away. He needed structural integrity. The viewport was a massive liability. He glanced around the cramped, overheated space, seeking something dense, something that could withstand re-entry or weapon fire. His eyes landed on a large, dented black box, a tertiary storage unit for maintenance records and environmental logs. It was non-essential, thick-walled durasteel, and completely sealed. It weighed perhaps 80 kilograms. "Perfectly useless, therefore perfectly useful," he murmured, applying the magnetic tether to the box. He dragged the heavy block, the effort causing his fatigued muscles to scream in protest. He braced it against the shattered viewport, securing it with every available clamp and tether he possessed. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would hold the pressure differential long enough for a hard burn. He took a moment to inspect his work. An improvised, overheating, missile-shaped coffin, powered by a coolant pump, shielded by old service logs. It was the epitome of Omega Prime methodology. Suddenly, a small red warning light began to flash rhythmically on his auxiliary power monitor. Not a system failure, but a communications signal, a brief encrypted burst hitting the exterior of the pipe. It wasn't Brelin's signal. The frequency was aggressive, rapid, and unknown. Corvin froze, his heart slamming against his ribs. He had silenced Nomara, but he hadn't silenced the universe. Someone had found his debris trail faster than expected. He rerouted the suit's internal sensors to analyze the signature, but the primitive equipment gave him only fragments. The signal was highly directional, implying a tracking beam, and it was repeating a specific sequence. Drevix. The signature matched the communication patterns of the specific militarized Drevix faction they had faced on Tau Ceti. The blood on the deck plating, the ghost of failure, it all flooded back. These weren't anonymous hunters. These were professionals who knew exactly what the data packet contained, and they were hunting him with a cold, unforgiving malice. Corvin initiated the pump ignition sequence. The reaction spindle whined, a sound of building tension, but nothing happened. He checked the wiring. The primary regulators, which he had so efficiently bypassed, were now drawing too much power from his suit batteries, draining them at an alarming rate. The battery is the choke point, he realized. The system was designed to prevent catastrophic overloading, even when manually overridden. He needed to sacrifice a major system to power the drive. The dilemma. His options displayed starkly. 1. Cut the power to the primary life support regulator. This would solve the power issue, giving him the burst he needed, but his limited air supply would stop recycling, slowly poisoning him with carbon dioxide, and his internal cooling would fail completely. He would gain speed, but lose consciousness within 10 minutes. 2. Disconnect the heavy black storage box from the viewport and use its internal shielding material to create a secondary localized power conduit around the fusion coil. This would take critical time, at least 30 seconds exposed, but would conserve life support. The Drevix tracking signal hit the hull again, harder this time. They were closing fast. 30 seconds was a lifetime. Corvin felt the feverish heat inside his suit intensify, the metallic scent of his fear thick in the recycled air. He had to go fast. He lifted his multi-tool, bypassing the cumbersome controls, and slashed the primary coolant line on his suit's back. A burst of icy helium vented instantly, cooling him sharply, but the life support regulator immediately flashed red. He had made the choice. Speed over sustainability. With the power redirected, the fusion coil spun up instantly. The noise was immense, a deep, earth-shaking thrum that vibrated through the hull and into his bones. The coolant pump, now an engine, forced the hot plasma exhaust out of the exterior vents. The 60-meter pipe section jerked violently, throwing Corvin hard against the bulkhead. He barely maintained his grip on the internal handle. The acceleration was savage, unguided and utterly effective. He was moving, accelerating away from Velasung Dry at a phenomenal rate, leaving a massive flaring heat signature for any hunter to track. He looked at his life support timer. 9 minutes and 20 seconds until oxygen depletion. The Drevik signature vanished from the sensor, overwhelmed by the energy of his own makeshift drive. He had outrun the initial tracking. He stabilized his position, managing the thruster output by sheer effort, the sweat dripping into his eyes. He had survived the mechanical phase. Now came the human price. Then, a new sensor reading flashed red on his main screen, something massive and entirely unexpected. It wasn't the Mothership fleet, nor the Drevik's rapid assault vessel. It was a colossal, static energy signature that materialized instantly in his projected trajectory, a massive presence that warped the starlight around it. It was an unregistered, heavily armored vessel of unknown origin, 3 times the size of any Tier 1 carrier. It had not decloaked, it had simply arrived bypassing conventional warp physics. And it was waiting directly in his path. Its massive primary weapon port, a cannon designed for orbital defense, not small craft engagement, swiveled slowly, locking onto his tiny makeshift vehicle. Corvin watched the charging sequence begin, the blue internal light of the cannon building rapidly, its energy signature blinding on his sensor display. He had escaped the system only to run headlong into a bigger, far more dangerous monster. He had 8 minutes of oxygen left. He was accelerating directly into a kill shot. And worst of all, he realized the new threat was the only reason the Dreviks had disappeared. They weren't tracking him anymore. They were running from it. Omega Prime, Corvin whispered into the silent helmet, a single sharp laugh escaping his dry throat. I think I just found the real apex predator. The blue light of the colossal weapon filled his compromised viewport, turning the internal netting from a web of cracks into a blinding supernova. Corvin didn't flinch. He was locked on a straight-line trajectory towards certain annihilation. 6 minutes of breathable air remained, the air growing thick and hot, laced with the metallic taste of carbon dioxide buildup. He had no time for evasive action, and no hope of surviving the shot. If this was the end of Omega Prime, it would not be a statistical failure. It would be a very large, unnecessary death. He ripped the data packet from his chest holster, the sudden movement causing his muscles to cramp from the heat and fatigue. The data packet, the core objective, was the only remaining variable. He needed to know what was worth this scale of ordnance. He used the specialized port on his multi-tool to interface the packet with his suit's battered auxiliary diagnostic display. The transfer was crude, slow, and almost certainly left a digital trace, but he didn't care about encryption or security anymore. The files began to cycle across his internal display, overwhelming the bright red life support warnings. The initial decryption key files scrolled past, complex algorithms for fleet defense. But then, the structure changed. The logic gates weren't designed to protect their assets, they were designed to disable them. Corvin felt a cold dread that went beyond the failing life support. The signature wasn't alien, it was proprietary. Tier 0 code, Nomara's handiwork. The data packet he held was not a valuable encryption key, it was the master kill switch for the entire Mothership command structure in this sector. It was designed to systematically paralyze every integrated defense system and every carrier, leaving the whole region defenseless. Corvin cross-referenced the unique frequency emanating from the massive vessel ahead. The analysis was instant and damning. Its hull design, though unregistered, carried the structural resonance signature of a heavily modified pre-collapse Raumschiff, built by the very same core corporation that funded the Mothership AI project. It wasn't a hostile force, it was a black ops vessel, waiting for the sector to be deactivated so it could move in and seize the assets. The truth settled on him with the weight of absolute zero. This wasn't an interception mission. It was a planned, hostile corporate takeover, executed by the Oversight Committee, led by Sylvan Roque, using Nomara's cold, calculating logic as their instrument. His entire operation, the retrieval, the 51 million credits of collateral damage, his Omega Prime designation, had been a beautifully chaotic distraction designed to deliver the master key for internal treason. The true apex predator wasn't the Seven, or the Drevix, or the behemoth in front of him. It was the profit margin. He had 3 minutes of oxygen left. The impossible dilemma was stark and immediate. If he followed Roque's orders and proceeded to the vault, he would save himself from the kinetic shot, but he would ensure the data packet reached its destination, handing Roque and the corporate entity the keys to every vessel, including Brelin's medical relief ship on the outer rim. His survival meant the destruction of his own side and the guaranteed compromise of Brelin's fragile recovery. If he destroyed the packet, the immediate corporate takeover would be stalled, preventing widespread systemic collapse. But the massive ship in front of him was already committed to the kill. If he vaporized the key, he would lose the only evidence of Roque's treachery, ensuring his death would be recorded as a routine kinetic neutralization of a moral hazard. He stared at the data packet, no bigger than his thumb, the size of his entire moral universe. He had risked everything for a principle, not for the mission objective. Now, the principle demanded everything. Corvin chose the illogical option, the one that defied statistical prediction. He would destroy the packet. He had 4 minutes of oxygen remaining, 3 minutes too long to float and contemplate failure. He reached for the jury-rigged power cables connected to the fusion coil. He would not simply disable the packet, he would vaporize it, making retrieval and forensic analysis impossible. He reversed the polarity on the power conduit, preparing to channel the raw energy of the pump's engine back through the data key. 51 million credits of collateral damage, and now I destroy the objective, he whispered, a dry rasping sound in the hot air. Nomara would rate that as 0 efficiency. Good. He pressed the metal packet directly against the exposed, overheating fusion coil, the only thing hot enough for total thermal destruction. He slammed the activation switch. A blinding white light erupted from the coil as the highly volatile internal memory matrices of the packet began to melt, instantly generating a massive thermal spike. The kill switch was being erased. The white light of the melting packet was instantly eclipsed by the blue light of the charged cannon. The colossal vessel did not cease fire, it simply fired. The core of the massive weapon roared, not a directed energy beam, but a focused kinetic slug designed to obliterate any vessel, regardless of shielding. Corvin didn't hear the detonation. He felt the acceleration of his pipe coffin slow instantly, the force of the approaching shot acting like an invisible, heavy hand pressing against the black storage box he used for a viewport shield. His internal display flashed red. 3 minutes of oxygen. The kinetic slug was a dark, dense projectile the size of a small asteroid, moving at near light speed. It would hit in less than 5 seconds. He squeezed his eyes shut against the building blue inferno, knowing he was seconds from being vaporized. He had done his worst, and his worst had just failed. Then, his unauthorized beacon that he had sent to Brelin suddenly stopped its erratic flashing. It wasn't disrupted by the blast. It was replaced by a single encrypted, high-frequency signal burst on the same deep-band channel, a signal he hadn't heard in 3 years, but that he knew with bone-deep certainty. It was a confirmation, a return signal. She answered. Corvin felt a desperate, primal surge of relief and absolute terror. He looked up at the charging kinetic slug, now filling his entire viewport, 3 seconds from impact. He was about to die, and he had just successfully called the one person he was trying to save directly into the path of the biggest gun in the sector. 1 second. The projectile was a physical manifestation of destruction, casting a shadow that enveloped his tiny, fragile craft. Just as the shadow consumed him, the encrypted signal from Braylon's channel did not shut down. It stabilized, and a heavy, familiar voice cut through the silence he had so carefully created, bypassing every filter and every protocol. "Corvan, you magnificent idiot. You always were better at getting caught than getting out." The voice was rough, exhausted, and utterly real. Before Corvan could formulate a reply, the hull of his 60-meter pipe section dissolved around him, the metal instantly turning into shrapnel and plasma dust under the sheer, brutal impact of the kinetic slug. The last thing he felt was the terrifying, crushing weight of high-speed deceleration and the sudden, sharp, final silence of the vacuum. The crushing weight wasn't impact, it was deceleration. The kinetic slug hadn't vaporized the 60-meter pipe section, but had struck the improvised Durasteel shield, the black storage box, turning the 60-meter section into a focused crumple zone. The speed of the projectile was so immense that its deceleration shockwave acted like 1,000 atmospheres of pressure, transforming his makeshift coffin into a tin can of fractured metal and plasma dust. Corvan surfaced through layers of pain and vacuum-induced silence, finding himself pinned, not floating. The sound of Braylon's voice, rough and utterly real, had been the last sensation before the world became a heavy, cold darkness. When his internal display flickered back to life, the suit registered 0.0% oxygen. The last 3 minutes had been pure neurological inertia, running on residual trauma. The internal air was thick and burned, but he was breathing. He realized he was no longer in the pipe. He was lying flat on a deck plating that vibrated with a faint, high-frequency hum, the distinct thrum of a high-power stealth drive running at maximum tolerance. The smell of the air was intoxicatingly clean, laced with the sharp, sterile scent of iodine and something vaguely floral, a scent he associated only with Braylon Fraser's medical kits. "Easy, Omega Prime. You look like a poorly wrapped package of scrap metal." The voice was closer now. Not a transmission, but a physical presence. Corvan tried to move, but a massive weight, not the wreckage, but a heavy thermal blanket, kept him immobilized. Every fiber in his body screamed, protesting the sudden return to gravity. He felt the dull, searing ache of ruptured capillaries in his eyes and the sticky warmth of blood congealing inside his helmet seal. He managed to crack his eyes open. Braylon Fraser was kneeling beside him, her face framed by the severe lighting of a small emergency surgical theater. Her movements were precise, efficient, and filled with a cold, contained anger that was far more terrifying than any kinetic slug. She wasn't wearing her customary medical whites. She wore the deep grey of a combat engineer, her expression etched with a deep, consuming exhaustion. The suit was venting carbon monoxide. "Your internal life support regulator," she said, her voice low and cutting, "was manually severed." "Did you cut your own air for a better power curve, Corvan?" He managed a ragged cough. "Needed the burst. Data packet. Where?" "Gone. Vaporized." "Good job," she clipped, the sarcasm hitting him harder than the deceleration. "Your little theatrical farewell created enough residual thermal discharge that the corporate Raumschiff ahead thought you were a hostile fusion core rupture and fired on the energy signature, not the target. You bought yourself a fraction of a second." She used a sonic cutter to slice the ruined remnants of his armor from his chest. The data packet, what was left of it, a puddle of fused, radioactive metal, was gone. The treasonous kill switch was neutralized. "How?" Corvan rasped, fighting the rising nausea. "The stiletto," she said, confirming his desperate hope. "Sylvan Roke ordered it decommissioned and relegated to the outer rim as a medical relief runner. He didn't factor in that I know the original bypass codes, or that its engines are designed for rapid, surgical extraction, not long-haul triage. It was never meant to save lives, it was built to steal them." Braylon stood up, moving away, attending to a console humming with complex tracking algorithms. "We caught your signal. It bypassed every mothership protocol naturally. We found your debris trail 5 minutes after the shot. I utilized the stiletto's short-range jump capability, a maneuver that permanently degraded the primary reactor core, to place us exactly 5 meters above the kinetic slug's trajectory, creating a momentary energy shadow that deflected the bulk of the impact force. You were scooped out of the collapsing hull by 2 drones. We are now running on 50% power and a prayer, Corvin. All because you couldn't resist making a point with 51 million credits of infrastructure. The sheer scope of the sacrifice Brelan had made, destroying a classified vessel and jeopardizing her own fragile freedom for his reckless stupidity, landed on him like a physical weight. The bottom of the well, Auto Julgamento. He looked up at the ceiling of the surgical bay, the flickering emergency lights casting long, unsteady shadows. He wasn't a hero. He was a liability, a toxic element who dragged everyone down with his necessary chaos. I found the packet's contents, he managed, the words tasting like ash. Roke. It was a kill switch for the fleet, corporate treason. Brelan didn't turn around. I know. I ran the analysis on the incoming Black Ops vessel's tactical signature while retrieving your half-dead carcass. They are using Nomara's deep-band tracking algorithms. They knew what you had, and they knew exactly where you were going. You were the delivery drone, Corvin. She finally faced him, her eyes dark, heavy with accusation. You didn't destroy the packet to save the fleet. You destroyed it to avoid being complicit with Roke, to feel clean for a minute. Just like Tau Ceti, you're always looking for the biggest fire to jump into, hoping the heat will burn off the past. The silence that followed was suffocating, filled only with the thrum of the overstressed engine. She had sliced him open and exposed the raw, ugly truth. His chaos wasn't about strategy. It was about seeking emotional parity for an ethical debt he could never repay. He realized the cold, hard logic of Nomara was right. He was a statistical moral hazard, optimizing self-destruction over simple obedience. He felt the fatigue, a profound, bone-deep exhaustion settle over him, not just from the zero-oxygen environment, but from 3 years of running this pattern. I'm tired, Brelan, he confessed, the admission tasting of rust and defeat. It wasn't pity he sought, but just the simple release of truth. I should have gone to the vault. I should have done what I was told for once. If you had gone to the vault, we would all be dead by tomorrow morning, Brelan countered, her tone softening slightly, recognizing the sincerity in his broken voice. But don't confuse exhaustion with wisdom. You created a massive burning problem, and now we are the cleanup crew, and they are still tracking us. She pointed to the main tactical screen. A persistent, tight, high-frequency signal was pulsing steadily. The mothership tracking grid managed by Nomara has locked onto the Stiletto's unique energy signature. They know this vessel is non-compliant, and since you are the only one unaccounted for, they assume you are aboard. They are calculating a kinetic strike window in 12 minutes. Nomara's algorithms are absolute, Corvin murmured, pulling himself onto one elbow, ignoring the protests of his body. The strike will be surgical. We have to lose the lock. I've tried everything. Stealth, non-linear jumps. It only makes the lock tighter. Nomara is running a dedicated analytical program on us, specifically because of your Omega Prime classification. The last chance, minima. Corvan looked at the tactical display, his brain, despite the fatigue, clicking back into operational mode. He wasn't looking for a loophole in physics, he was looking for a flaw in the bureaucracy. Nomara's code. It runs on maximizing efficiency and minimizing risk, correct? Yes, that's its core function, Brelan confirmed, running a hand through her short hair, a gesture of sheer stress. When I destroyed the kill switch packet, I channeled the residual energy through the fusion coil. Massive thermal spike, right? That energy spike was unique. Nomara registered it as a hostile event, not an internal system failure. It caused the Black Ops vessel to fire. He sat up fully now, pain receding behind the sharp edge of focus. Nomara calculates the cost of failure, the destruction of 51 million credits of infrastructure, and the deliberate annihilation of the objective packet. That defies logic. Nomara recorded that event as an irrational zero-efficiency outcome. Fed hates that result, Brelan. It needs to contain it, classify it, and eliminate it. Brelan leaned closer, finally seeing the angle. So, what is the flaw? The flaw is that the Mothership AI prioritizes the completion of the objective over all other metrics, including asset value, Corvin explained, his voice low and intense. The objective was the packet. I destroyed it. Nomara registered a complete terminal loss of objective, zero recovery potential. But the AI is still tracking the stiletto because it believes the vessel contains the next best thing. Me, the Omega Prime, the source of the chaotic data. He pointed a finger at the persistent tracking signal. That lock isn't on the stiletto's hull. It's on the unique, residual data signature of the vaporization event. It's tracking the ghost of the packet, not us. And how does that help us? Brelin asked, her skepticism evident. We give Nomara what it needs, a tangible statistical closure. We give it a new, final, irrational zero-efficiency outcome to process, Corvin said, reaching for his discarded helmet, which was cracked but mostly intact. He needed a transmitter, a powerful energy source, and something capable of carrying the spectral signature of the vaporized packet. He looked around the small medical bay. His eyes landed on the discarded radioactive remnants of the fused data packet, a hardened lump of useless metal still faintly buzzing with high-level residual Nomara code. We need to send the ghost of the packet somewhere else. We need a secondary target, one that is highly non-essential and completely untraceable after detonation. A buoy? Too slow. They'll identify it. We need velocity, something that already carries a statistical death warrant, Corvin decided, his mind racing. He pointed a shaky finger toward the rear access port. The two drones that scooped me out. Are they disposable? They're standard Tier 3 medical models, heavy shielding, slow and expensive. But yes, technically disposable. I need one, fully fueled, loaded with all the residual thermal residue we can scrape off the floor, including the packet remains. Then we need to program it for maximum velocity, directly toward the mothership's core tactical sector. Brelin stared at him, the plan dawning. You want to send a drone carrying the ghost of the failure directly into the heart of the mothership grid, giving Nomara the ultimate self-destructive data point to chase. Exactly. It will register as a self-immolation event, an irrational, total waste of assets traveling at maximum possible speed toward the center of the grid. Nomara will have to spend all its processing power calculating the threat vector of a statistical 0.0 outcome. It will be the perfect distraction, the ultimate act of spite against a statistical framework. It will buy us the jump window we need. He climbed off the surgical slab, leaning heavily against the bulkhead, his physical pain irrelevant now. We send the drone on a hard burn toward the mothership, Brelin. Then we jump the stiletto in the opposite direction, toward the outer rim. We make Nomara chase a nightmare it can't quantify. Brelin nodded, the exhaustion replaced by grim resolve. She started stripping the drone parts instantly. One flaw, Corvin. If Nomara realizes the drone is carrying only residual code and not the true packet, it will adjust the tracking back to us in seconds. It won't, Corvin promised, attaching the fused remains of the data packet to the drone's power core with 3 meters of high-tensile wire. Because the Mothership AI is designed to calculate every possibility except the one where a human being deliberately commits statistical suicide. This isn't logic, Brelin. This is pure, magnificent spite. He finished the wiring, the scent of burning metal filling the bay again. The drone was ready, a tiny, heavily weighted missile of bureaucratic failure. Initiating launch sequence, Brelin stated, her hands flying across the console. Jump drive charging. We have 45 seconds until we hit the jump parameters. The kinetic strike window closes in 8 minutes. Corvin manually launched the drone. It shot out of the rear port of the stiletto like a bullet, accelerating instantly toward the distant, invisible mothership grid, leaving a dense, confusing heat signature. 3 seconds later, the high-frequency tracking signal on the stiletto's tactical screen vanished completely, instantly replaced by a massive, all-consuming analytical alarm pulsing deep red across the entire grid. Nomara had swallowed the bait. It had identified the suicide drone as the new primary threat, a necessary statistical anomaly that required immediate processing and containment. "It's working," Brelin breathed, her knuckles white on the controls. We have 15 seconds to jump. Get strapped in, Corvin. Corvin didn't move toward the jump seats. He stared at the tactical screen, feeling a cold wash of adrenaline as the analytical alarm reached deafening levels. Nomara was furious. Then the red tactical alarm vanished. It was replaced by a single, focused energy spike originating from a source Brelin had specifically told him was dead. Brelin, stop the jump, now. What? Why? The mothership didn't just reroute the analysis, Corvin whispered, pointing at the single new energy spike. They woke up the dead. The source of the spike was Verlassung Dre, the station Corvin had vaporized. The residual fusion core, thought neutralized, had been reactivated by Nomara's desperate need for a secondary tracking mechanism. The small localized tracking signature was now hard-locked onto the Stiletto's stealth hull. Sylvan Roque didn't just want the packet, Corvin realized, a cold wave of dread washing over him. He wanted the ability to track the person who might destroy it. He left a secondary beacon. The tactical screen flashed a warning. Interference lock confirmed. Jump drive inhibited. They were pinned. The corporate Black Ops Raumschiff that had fired the kinetic slug, which had momentarily retreated to recalculate, was now vectoring back, guided by the reactivated station core. And they were just 45 seconds from jumping, too close to run, and too exposed to fight. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. Brelin slammed her fist onto the console, overriding the jump sequence at the 0.01 mark. The cabin lights flickered violently, protesting the sudden massive power diversion. Instead of the crushing lurch of hyperspace transit, the only sensation was the painful internal pressure of an aborted jump. The Stiletto shuddered, its overstressed core groaning like a wounded animal. "The inhibition lock is hard," Brelin grated, her voice tight with fury, staring at the small, persistent green spike on the tactical screen that denoted the station core. Roque built a fail-safe into the tracking matrix. The moment the primary objective, the packet, vanished, the secondary beacon on Verlassung Dry activated. It's broadcasting a high-frequency lock based on our proximity to the residual fusion signature. We are fixed in place. Corvin didn't need to be told. The corporate Raumschiff they had momentarily shaken off was now back on screen, its profile hardening from a distant smudge into a clear, menacing silhouette. Its kinetic weapons bays were cycling, preparing for the final clean kill. "How long until the primary lock from the Raumschiff is surgical?" Corvin asked, pulling himself into the navigator's seat, ignoring the searing pain in his ribs. Brelin's fingers flew across the board, pulling diagnostics from the mothership's dedicated Nomara feed. The full analytical strike profile, the one that won't just vaporize us but ensures zero recovery of data, is set for 3 minutes and 20 seconds. If we stay here, we get turned to subatomic dust. Corvin looked at the console, seeing the problem distilled to its simplest, most terrifying components. They had fought the algorithm with chaos and won the skirmish, but the system had deployed an old analog weapon, a dead beacon, a technical booby trap. The system always preferred a slow, predictable death to an uncontrolled variable. "We can't outrun the lock and we can't jump while it's active," Corvin summarized, leaning back, the exhaustion finally hitting him cold and heavy. "We have to neutralize the secondary tracking spike." "That means destroying the core on Verlassung Dry entirely," Brelin countered, her gaze sharp. "It's 2 sectors away. Even with the Stiletto's minimal weapons cache, we'd have to divert all remaining power to the drive core just to get into range, leaving us dead in the water for the return trip, vulnerable to the Raumschiff." "No." Corvin shook his head, a wry, grim smile touching his lips. "We don't use the Stiletto. We use the system's own efficiency mandate against it." He pointed at the tactical display. The Black Ops Raumschiff, closing fast, was currently calculating its trajectory based on 2 primary factors: the Stiletto's current location and the Verlassung Dre beacon, which provided rock-solid positional data. The Raumschiff's pilot, he knew, would be working on pure predictable protocol. "The Raumschiff is programmed for maximum efficiency, minimizing its own exposure," Corvin explained. "It won't fire until the target is completely vulnerable and the probability of collateral damage is minimized. It wants the clean kill. And that requires triangulation from the beacon, Brelin finished, following his logic with frightening speed. Exactly. If we introduce a catastrophic variable into the Raumschiff's own system, its Nomara subroutine will force a hard calculation pause, a delay of crucial seconds while it reassesses the threat to itself. Corvin spun back to the small maintenance bay behind the cockpit, where the stripped components of the medical drones lay scattered. That other drone, he said, his eyes fixed on the heavy shielding of the drone's shell. The one we didn't use, is its comms array still functional? Yes, mostly, Brelin said, skepticism laced in her tone. But we can't transmit anything through the Nomara jammer grid. We don't need to transmit, Corvin muttered, his mind already 3 steps ahead, calculating angles and energy signatures. We need to broadcast a statistical lie, one that Nomara must prioritize above all other variables. He grabbed the remaining drone's heavy shielding and a coil of emergency wiring, high-tension cabling designed for deep void repairs. He started working with brutal speed and economical movement, cutting and splicing. The stiletto has a directional high-gain antenna, correct? The old analog kind, Tier 1, before the encryption layers were mandated. Yes, but it's weak, only rated for 3,000 kilometers. Perfect. We load the shielding onto the antenna and give it a power surge from the jump drive capacitor. Just a small bleed. We program the drone's internal comms to receive the Raumschiff's tactical telemetry frequency, but we don't transmit back. Brelin watched him assemble the improvised transmitter, her expression shifting from apprehension to cold understanding. You want to create a localized artificial interference field directly in the path of the Raumschiff's sensor sweep. Not just interference, we create a statistical paradox, Corvin said, tightening the last connection. The Raumschiff is operating under the assumption that we are a small, isolated target. We send the drone, fully shielded, into a specific high-traffic vector, right into the line of sight of the Raumschiff's weapons array, and we program it to mimic the heat signature of a fully armed, high-speed military asset, a battleship Brelin, a ghost ship. A ghost ship that appears only on the Raumschiff's local radar, right before it hits the fire command, Brelin finished, a touch of dark humor entering her voice. The Nomara subroutine will register the sudden close proximity of a massive unauthorized tactical threat and immediately impose a hard delay, forcing the Raumschiff to reroute power from its weapons to evasive maneuvers. It will pause the kill. And in that pause, we move, Corvin confirmed, taping the final connections. He hauled the rigged drone, bulky and heavy, to the airlock. The airlock hissed open, venting a small cloud of atmosphere into the black. Target trajectory? He asked, bracing himself against the inevitable kickback of the drone launch. Brelin locked the coordinates. 91 degrees, elevation 0.5, direct intercept course with the Raumschiff tactical sweep in 70 seconds. Go. Corvin hit the manual launch and pushed the drone out into the void. It launched with a silent, powerful thrust, accelerating rapidly toward the distant hostile vessel. The energy bleed from the jump drive capacitor gave the drone's internal generator the necessary kick. On the tactical screen, the Raumschiff continued its steady approach. 70 seconds was an eternity. 50 seconds. The Raumschiff weapons bays locked into position. 40 seconds. Then, at 32 seconds, the inevitable happened. The Raumschiff detection grid registered the sudden, impossible presence of a massive, unidentified energy signature directly in its path. The hostile vessel's calculated trajectory immediately shattered. The Raumschiff tilted violently, diverting all thrust to a sharp, unexpected, evasive maneuver, banking hard to avoid a collision with the Phantom battleship. The weapons bays retracted instantly. It worked, Brelin shouted, the relief thick and palpable. Nomara mandated evasive action. The strike window is paused. Now, Corvin commanded, already strapping himself into the jump chair, we use the pause to deal with the beacon. Brelin immediately diverted the stiletto's remaining jump drive power, a desperate, reckless move, into the ship's primary plasma cannon. The vessel's interior lights dimmed dramatically, draining the life support systems to feed the archaic weapon. We have 15 seconds before the Raumschiff recalibrates and ignores the Phantom, Brelin warned. Fire the cannon manually, Corvin. Maximum yield. We have one shot to hit a core 2 sectors away. Corvin gripped the firing controls, his eyes fixed on the Verlasung dry beacon spike. It was a pinprick of green in the blackness, utterly fragile, yet holding them absolutely captive. He felt the cannon charge, a heavy, resonant thrum deep in the stiletto's belly, accompanied by the sharp metallic smell of superheated circuitry. The power strain was immense. The ship was screaming its defiance. Aim for the weakness, he thought. The flaw isn't in the geometry, it's in the maintenance. He remembered the schematics for the old Verlasung dry station. The residual core was housed in the original utility tower, a tower that was structurally weakened by decades of neglect and bad patch jobs. Corvin didn't aim for the core itself. He aimed for the auxiliary coolant manifolds directly adjacent to the core housing, knowing the plasma burst would vaporize the patch jobs and cause a massive, asymmetrical implosion. He wasn't aiming for destruction. He was aiming for statistical obliteration. He fired. The cannon roared, a blinding, white-hot lance of focused plasma that ripped across the void. The power drain was total. Every system in the stiletto shut down instantly, plunging the cockpit into absolute, terrifying darkness, illuminated only by the brief, spectacular death of the shot. There was a measurable moment of silence, followed by a distant, colossal flash of green and white light where Verlasung Dre had been. It wasn't a clean explosion. It was a violent, total collapse into vacuum, a final, definitive erasure of 5 decades of infrastructure. Then the only sound was the harsh rattling of Corvin's own breathing. Brelin punched the console again, bringing the emergency lights back on. The screens sputtered to life. The green beacon spike was gone. The tactical screen was clean, showing only the distant, confused silhouette of the Raumschiff, still reeling from the ghost collision, its targeting systems fried by the massive energy spike from the cannon fire. "The lock is gone," Brelin breathed, leaning back, the strain visible on her exhausted face. "We are free." Corvin tried to transmit a confirmation, but only static came out. He looked down at the console. The cannon fire, combined with the earlier use of the jump drive capacitor, had fully depleted the Stiletto's main reactor cell. They were running on emergency battery power only. "The price, Brelin," Corvin said, his voice flat, exhausted. "The Stiletto is dead in space." Brelin nodded slowly, her eyes drifting over the non-functional tactical screens. "We have propulsion for maybe 4 hours, minimal heat, and no jump capability. We killed the beacon, but we destroyed the only thing that could save us." The irony was crushing, perfect in its awful symmetry. The ultimate act of defiance had cost their final means of escape. Corvin pushed the visor of his cracked helmet up. The air was thinning again, recycled and tainted with ozone and burnt metal. He looked out the main viewport into the vast, indifferent blackness of space. The Raumschiff was still there, a wounded predator circling, trying to put the pieces of the puzzle back together. It hadn't killed them yet, but it knew where they were, and it was patient. Brelin leaned forward, her shoulder touching his, a gesture of shared exhaustion and shared guilt. "So, Omega Prime, what is the new statistical unreliability?" Corvin didn't answer right away. He focused on the immediate visceral cost. He was deeply injured, they were stranded, and the system had been momentarily stunned, not defeated. But they were alive, and the threat of corporate treason was exposed. He pulled a fresh packet of the real tobacco from his jacket, noting the way his hand shook. He held the packet out to Brelin. "No thanks. I quit after Tausetti," she said, her voice dry. "This one isn't for smoking," Corvin countered, opening the packet. He sprinkled the valuable, pungent tobacco leaves onto the floor, scattering the dry, fragile remnants across the sterile deck plating. "It's for making a point," he murmured. "The corporate Raumschiff will track the faint residual heat of the Stiletto eventually, but they won't expect us to wait for them. We are going to abandon ship." Brelin looked at the scattering of tobacco, then back at the dark viewport. "In what? The single remaining medical drone?" "No," Corvin said, shaking his head. "In the void. We use the life pods for shielding, not transport. We cut our ties to the physical world, Brelin. We give Nomara nothing left to track." He looked out into the absolute blackness, the faint, shimmering light of a distant stellar cluster, reflecting in his tired eyes. The biggest lie they could tell the supreme calculating system wasn't a sudden explosion or a phantom ship. It was the statistical impossibility of a human simply disappearing. "We go off the map entirely," Corvin said, standing up on shaky legs, "and we start walking toward the outer rim. If Namara runs the calculation on two unarmored biologicals drifting through the void, it will classify the probability of survival as 0.0. That is our perfect stealth profile." Brelin stood up, her jaw set, looking not at the vastness of the void, but at the sheer insanity of his proposition. 2 days of life support in the emergency pods, no velocity, hostile territory, she listed, counting the certainties of their impending death. "You're serious?" "Never more so," Corvin replied. "We trade the complexity of the ship for the simplicity of survival. Come on, Fraser. We've killed the systems. Now we just have to outlast the bureaucratic paperwork." He turned towards the abandoned lifepod bay, his battered figure already fading into the shadows of the silent, dead stiletto. The fight was not over. It had merely been stripped down to its core. One man, one woman, and the cold indifference of the endless black, facing an enemy whose true power was not its size, but its stubborn refusal to acknowledge human resilience. The air in the cockpit grew heavy, thick with the scent of human fatigue and the silent acceptance of an impossible journey. The residual noise inside the stiletto wasn't static anymore. It was the soft, dying hiss of failing atmospheric processes, a sound that felt less like equipment failure and more like the ship's final sigh. Corvin leaned heavily against the airlock frame, the cold radiating through his uniform. He didn't smell the ozone and superheated metal anymore, just the thin, sterile air of a sealed environment, nearing total shutdown. The silence was heavy, vast, and final, a profound absence of mechanical resistance that was far more terrifying than any battle cry. His hand went automatically to his ribs, 2 cracked, maybe 3. Brelin had already stabilized them with a compression wrap from the medical kit, her movements efficient and devoid of judgment. They were partners again, bound by mutual catastrophe and an impossible future. "We destroyed the ship for a few minutes of evasion," Brelin stated, her voice calm, utterly matter-of-fact. She was methodically removing non-essential gear from the 2 life pods, the small cramped capsules rated only for short-term emergency rescue, not long-haul travel. "We traded the vehicle for the destination," Corvin corrected, wincing as he shifted his weight. "The stiletto was compromised anyway. Now at least the Raumschiff has to track an anomaly, not a data spike." He looked down at the deck, where the fine, dry tobacco leaves were scattered, a silent, superstitious gesture of finality. He had spilled something once that cost 51 million credits. Now he was spilling the last of his luxuries for a prayer. The symmetry was disgusting. "What about the data packet?" Brelin asked, not looking up. Corvin tapped the shielded pocket beneath his jacket. "Safe. It's what made us targets, and it's the only proof we have. Roke wants us dead because we know the truth. Namara wants us contained because we represent statistical unreliability. And what is the plan when the Raumschiff figures out we're not tracking, not transmitting, and that the only source of residual heat comes from 2 human bodies slowly freezing in unpowered life pods?" "It will pause," Corvin said, walking toward the smaller of the 2 pods. The space was barely enough for a fully grown man, forcing a claustrophobic crouch. The corporate protocol dictates that if a target cannot be confirmed by 3 independent sources, the assets must be preserved, not vaporized. Nomara will calculate the survival rate of 2 biologicals adrift in deep space as 0.0. It will assume we are dead and that any retrieval attempt is a waste of resources. He forced himself inside the capsule, the metal pressing immediately against his shoulders. The air was colder here. He activated the minimal environmental controls, enough for 36 hours of recycled oxygen and basic filtration, perhaps 40 if they remained utterly still. "We rely on the system's arrogance," Brelin summarized, securing the external lock on her own pod nearby. "We rely on its efficiency," Corvin countered. "We are simply the least efficient outcome. Therefore we are ignored." They sealed the hatches, The only illumination came from the tiny, battery-powered indicator lights, a sickly, pulsating green that cast the pod's metallic interior in a harsh, cold glow. He rubbed his hands against his thighs, feeling the cold seep deep into his muscles. Corvin closed his eyes, hearing the ringing silence again. The silence was total now, the absence of the failing auxiliary drone complete. He realized that this was the real cost of their victory, the loss of all technological tether. They weren't heroes who rode off into the sunset. They were debris jettisoned by a system that couldn't categorize their escape. He focused on his breathing. Slow, controlled. He could feel the small, hard outline of the data packet digging into his chest beneath the jacket. A soft, almost silent tap came from Brelin's pod wall, a deliberate rhythm of 2 short, 1 long. "Are we doing this?" Corvin tapped back, the response equally quiet. 3 short taps. "Yes." He pressed the external magnetic release. The small life pod, still magnetically attached to the hull of the dead stiletto, was now officially disconnected from the mothership. The only thing keeping the pod from drifting into the void was the emergency tether still secured to the larger pod holding Brelin. They were tethered together, physically and professionally, marooned in the black, their entire world reduced to 2 cubic meters of cramped space and 36 hours of life support. Corvin settled into the agonizingly tight position. He had been designated Omega Prime, the self-generating moral hazard. Now, facing the cold indifference of the vacuum, he realized the insult was the highest compliment, because a machine that calculates probabilities could never calculate human will. He thought back to the ruptured fusion conduit, the 51 million credits of damage, the sickening smell of melted plastic, and the dry, metallic tang of regret that permeated the station. The cost had been immense, but the price of remaining silent would have been higher. He didn't regret the chaos. He regretted the loss of the coffee. He stared into the green-lit darkness of his coffin-sized capsule. They were statistical zeros now, adrift in a system that had no designation for them except failure. But they were moving, slowly, together. The absolute blackness outside the viewport pressed against the glass, cold and indifferent, waiting for the oxygen to run out. He spoke, his voice barely a whisper in the tiny enclosed space. "We traded the risk of annihilation for the certainty of consequence," he murmured, a final summation for the ghost of Nomara. He waited for Brelin's dry, inevitable response, but she was silent, focused on conservation. He was a ghost now, adrift in the vast, uncaring void. The package was secure. The fight was over. The work began now. He felt the metallic tang in the air, the dry, artificial taste of recycled fear. He closed his eyes. "We won the battle. But the war is just starting. And it's going to be cold." This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.